Morning Without Dawn. A Tale of Arthur Dayne. Being an account of the Sword of the Morning, his youth, his service, his exile, and his return. Fan fiction. All characters belong to their respective creators. Prologue: The Sword of the Morning. Before there was a Sword of the Morning, there was the sword. It fell from the sky. The Maester of Starfall, the one who held the post 300 years after the fall, who had read every account the house possessed and had written several of his own, recorded it this way: a light in the night sky, moving fast and trailing fire, visible from the coast of Dorne for the space of perhaps 30 seconds before it struck the hills east of the Torrentine with a sound like the end of something. The shepherds who had seen it from the high pastures said it had been white, brighter than white. The kind of brightness that left a mark on the eye that took several minutes to fade. The Danes found it in the morning. The crater was not large, smaller than they had expected, given the sound and the light. At its center, half buried in scorched earth that was still warm to the touch, was a mass of metal unlike anything any smith in Dorne had seen before. It was pale. Pale as milk, pale as bone, pale as the sky at the moment before true dawn when the darkness has given up and the light has not yet arrived. The metal was dense in a way that made its size deceptive. It weighed considerably more than it appeared to, which the first man to try to lift it discovered when he lost his footing and sat down hard in the charred grass. They brought it back to Starfall. It took 3 generations and 4 master smiths before anyone found a way to work it. The metal was unlike iron and unlike steel, and unlike the Valyrian alloy that some had suggested it might be related to. It did not respond to heat the way metals responded to heat, did not flow or pool, but only softened slightly, reluctantly, as though being worked against its nature. The first smith who attempted it said afterward that it felt less like shaping metal and more like convincing it. The second agreed. The third, who managed to produce the first viable edge, said he had simply stopped trying to impose himself on the material and had instead tried to understand what shape the material already wanted to be. It wanted to be a sword. The blade that emerged from those years of patient work was the length of an arming sword and waited for an arming sword and handled like one, but it was nothing like any arming sword made before or since. The pale metal had a quality that smiths and scholars had struggled for centuries to name accurately. It was not quite a shine and not quite a glow. It did not produce light in the way that something lit from within produced light. It was more that it gathered available light and held it, refused to release it back into the room, so that in any space less than brilliantly illuminated, the blade seemed to carry a faint luminescence of its own. In full darkness it was barely perceptible. In the thin gray light of early morning it was striking. In full sunlight it was, by most accounts, almost painful to look at directly. The Danes named it Dawn, which was accurate in several senses simultaneously. The question of who could carry it was settled, over the following generations, by the sword itself. The blade was given to the finest knight of each generation, tested first against other blades, then against other standards, a slow accretion of tradition that eventually codified into the title, Sword of the Morning. Only a knight of extraordinary ability could claim the name. Only the Sword of the Morning could carry Dawn. The sword passed from generation to generation this way, skipping sons who were merely excellent in favor of sons who were something more, occasionally skipping entire generations in which no Dane rose to the required standard, resting on the wall of the great hall and waiting with the patience of something that had already waited in the dark of space for a very long time and had no particular urgency about the next few decades. There were 9 swords of the morning recorded in the house histories before Arthur Dayne. The most celebrated before him was Sir Davos Dayne, who had carried Dawn at the Battle of the Red Dunes 400 years prior, and had reportedly unhorsed 11 knights in succession before taking a lance through the visor, an account that the more skeptical Maesters regarded as embellishment, and that the less skeptical Maesters pointed out was consistent with every other detailed account of what happened when a sword of the morning took the field. The sword had never been lost in battle. It had never been captured. It had been set down voluntarily exactly twice in the recorded history of House Dayne, both times by swords of the morning who had concluded that the war they had been fighting was not the war they had thought it was. The Maester who wrote the most complete history of Dawn noted in his conclusion that the sword seemed to have an opinion about who carried it. He meant this loosely, as a way of describing the pattern he had observed over 3 centuries of records, the pattern by which the sword consistently ended up in the hands of knights who were not merely skilled but who were, in some quality that defied easy description, present in a particular way, awake to the moment, fully inhabiting the space they occupied. He called this quality grace, and then crossed it out and wrote precision, and then crossed that out too and left the page blank except for a note in the margin. There is a word for this that I do not have. He was right that there was a word for it. He was right that he did not have it. Part 1. The Sword of the Morning. The Starfall. The sword came to him in a dream. He was 10 years old and sleeping in the high tower of Starfall, the ancestral seat of House Dayne, where the Torrentine met the summer sea, and the salt winds carried the smell of orange blossoms up from the terraced gardens below. The dream was wordless and without form, as the truest dreams often are, only a brightness, white and cold and absolute, like the heart of a star before it tears itself apart. He woke with his hands clutching the wool of his blanket and the certainty already fatting from his chest, the way a man feels after a thing of great importance has been said to him in a language he does not quite understand. He lay still for a long time, watching the gray light of false dawn leak through the arrow slit. Somewhere below, a servant stirred the coals, the scrape of iron on stone, the settling of ash. The sword was dawn, and it waited in the great hall where it had always waited, and where it would wait still long after all the Danes were dust. It had been made from the heart of a fallen star, or so the Maester said, though he said it in the careful way that Maesters spoke of such things, as if the words were a habit rather than a belief. The blade was pale as milk, pale as bone, pale as the first cold light of morning. It was not beautiful in the way that other beautiful swords were beautiful. It did not have the lithe elegance of Valyrian steel, that liquid quality, like dark water caught and frozen. It was beautiful the way a glacier was beautiful, or a cliff face, or an old wolf's gaze, a beauty that did not care whether you noticed it. Only a knight of extraordinary ability could be named Sword of the Morning and carry dawn. His father had explained this when Arthur was no older than 5, with the grave and sober certainty that Edric Dayne brought to all matters of consequence. His father was not a cold man, but he believed in the proper weight of things, and some things, he felt, ought not to be lightened. His elder brother Sir Oren had not been given the sword. This was not spoken of in the halls of Starfall, but it hung in every room like smoke from a banked fire. Oren was 6 years Arthur's elder, which had made him a figure of considerable authority in Arthur's early childhood. The capable one, the heir, the son who had come first and occupied the space a first son occupies in a house like theirs with the easy confidence of someone who had never had reason to doubt his position. He was a fine swordsman. He was, by any reasonable measure, a very good knight. In most houses, in most families, across most of the 7 kingdoms, he would have been more than enough. He was not enough to carry dawn. The sword had its own criteria, older than any house's wishes, and those criteria were not met by good or fine or very capable. They required something else, something that announced itself in the way a person moved and thought and existed in the moment of a fight, and when it appeared in Arthur's hands at 10 years old it was clear to everyone, to the Maesters, to the guardsmen who drilled against him, and most quietly and most painfully to Oren himself, that the sword's next bearer was going to be the younger brother. Oren never said anything about it. This was, Arthur thought, in some ways worse than if he had. A resentment spoken could be addressed. A resentment perfectly managed and never expressed was a different thing entirely. A thing that lived in the particular quality of a glance held a moment too long, in the extra formality of address between brothers who had grown up sleeping in adjacent rooms. Oren was never unkind. He was never unfair. He was simply careful, in all his interactions with Arthur, in the way that a man was careful around something he could not allow himself to feel. Arthur understood, without entirely knowing when the understanding had come to him, that the sword would one day be his. Not because he was owed it, the sword was owed to no one, belonged to no one, but he understood it the way he understood the color of his own eyes, as a simple fact, neither proud nor humble. What he did not understand, lying in the gray light of that tower room at 10 years of age, was what it would cost. He began training in earnest the summer he turned 10, though in truth he had been drilling with wooden swords in the yard since his legs were barely long enough to hold the proper stance. But there is a difference between drilling and yearning, and it was not until his 10th year that the sword became something he wanted for himself rather than something he was told to want. The first time he moved a man 3 times his size, a guardsman named Will who had served his father for 15 years and whose arms were like the roots of old trees, he felt it. Not triumph, exactly, but recognition. The sword in his hand became less a tool and more an extension of something already there. He moved through Will's guard not by strength, for he had little of that yet, but by instinct, a reading of intention, a knowledge of where the big man would commit before the big man knew it himself. Will sat in the dirt and blinked up at him with an expression that Arthur would see many times after, on many faces, from many men who had not expected to be surprised. "You've your father's eye," Will said at last, "but something else besides." He did not know what to call it then. Grace was too soft, precision was too cold. What he had was something like both, a quality of absolute attention, of living entirely in the present moment of the fight so that past and future ceased to exist. In that narrow space between attack and parry, between feint and commitment, Arthur Dayne was simply present, and in that presence he was, for reasons he could not explain, entirely at home. His swordsmaster, an old knight named Sir Eldrick, who had spent 40 years along the Dornish marches, and had the scars to prove it, told him on the last day of his formal instruction that he had nothing left to teach him. "Then who will teach me?" Arthur asked. He was 15. Sir Eldrick looked at him for a long moment. "Everyone who comes at you with a blade," he said, "and God help them." He was knighted at 16, which was uncommon enough to occasion comment. His father held the ceremony in the great hall of Starfall, with the sun coming in off the sea in long bars of gold, and the smell of salt and flowers very strong. His brother Oren stood at the far end of the hall with an expression of careful neutrality that cost him, Arthur thought, more than anyone else in the room could know. Oren had been knighted at 19, a respectable age, an age that had been praised by their father and noted with approval by the lords of neighboring houses. 3 years later, his younger brother was knighted at 16 with a sword that sang, and the hall filled with the quiet amazement of people watching something extraordinary, and Oren stood at the far end and wore his careful neutral expression, and did not look away, and did not flinch. Arthur had not known, until that moment, how much it must have cost him. He was given dawn that same day. His father brought it out wrapped in cloth of silver, and held it out with hands that did not quite shake, and Arthur took it, and it was lighter than he had expected and heavier in the ways that mattered. The pale blade seemed to gather what little light was in the hall and hold it, refusing to give it back, the way only the rarest things do. He had been around it all his life, had watched it from corners and doorways since boyhood, the way children watched adults they feared and admired in equal measure, but holding it was different. Holding it was the difference between understanding the sea and standing in it. He wore it on his right hip and carried a second blade on his left, a Dornish arming sword of good steel that Sir Eldrick had given him on his last day of instruction, a parting gift from a teacher who understood that the finest swordsman in a generation deserved more than one weapon. The second blade was nothing compared to Dawn, of course. Nothing was. But Arthur had learned to fight with 2 swords in his final years of training, and the double geometry of it, the way the pair of blades opened up lines of attack that no single weapon could manage, had become as natural to him as breathing. Dawn in his right hand and the arming sword in his left, and the world arranged itself accordingly. He was Sir Arthur Dayne of Starfall, the Sword of the Morning. He was 16 years old. The sky beyond the high windows was the hard bright blue of autumn in Dorne. He thought of the dream, the star falling, the white and absolute brightness. He thought, this is a beginning and also an end. He did not know then how right he was. Aye, purple and gold. King's Landing in those years was a city of spectacle and rot in equal measure. The Red Keep rose above the stink of Flea Bottom like a great stain in reverse, and within its walls, the court of Aerys II Targaryen maintained all the gorgeous ceremony of the realm's most ancient dynasty, while the rot worked quietly through the floors beneath. Arthur arrived at court in his 17th year, brought thither by Lord Commander Gerald Hightower himself, who had ridden to Starfall after hearing the stories that traveled ahead of young Sir Arthur like Harold Smoke. Hightower was a large and serious man, white-haired even then, with the kind of dignity that accrues not from birth, but from a lifetime of keeping faith. He sat across from Arthur's father in the solar of Starfall, and made the case with the blunt courtesy of a man unused to asking for things. "Your son is a gift," Hightower said, "not to House Dayne, to the realm." Edric Dayne looked at his youngest son for a long time. There were things in his face that he did not say and would not say. "It is Arthur's choice," he said at last. Arthur thought of Dawn, which he would be permitted to bring. The sword went where he went, and no Lord Commander could tell him otherwise, for you did not take the Sword of the Morning from the Sword of the Morning, and of the second blade at his hip. He thought of the dream. He thought of Sir Eldrick's last words. "I will go," he said. He had ideas about what he was riding toward. He was 17 years old and had grown up in Starfall hearing stories about Targaryens, the way children heard stories about dragons, magnificent, inevitable, the proper subjects of legend. The Kingsguard was the highest order of knighthood in the realm, its members the finest warriors alive, sworn to something larger than themselves. He believed this. He had believed it the way a man believed in the ground beneath his feet, not through examination, but through the simple accumulation of never having had reason to doubt it. King's Landing corrected him, though slowly, and in ways he was not immediately willing to accept. The king was brilliant in fragments. There were hours when Aerys II could hold court with a sharpness and charm that silenced the stories, and increasingly unrecognizable in the spaces between. He was suspicious of counsel. He was cruel in a way that had, in the years before Arthur's arrival, been occasional, and was now becoming habitual. He sat on the Iron Throne and he heard petitions, and he laughed at things that were not amusing and fell silent at things that were. The court had learned to flow around him, the way water flows around a stone, always moving, always finding the angle that did not create resistance. The Kingsguard protected him. That was the vow. Arthur had taken the vow, and it had settled on his shoulders in the White Sword Tower like a second skin, and he had believed in it with the sincerity of a man who had never taken a vow he did not intend to honor. He took his vows in the White Sword Tower on a morning in early spring, kneeling on cold stone in a room that smelled of old candles and older oaths. The white cloak settled on his shoulders, and he felt its weight, not the weight of cloth, but the weight of what it meant. He was no longer entirely of Starfall. He was of no house, no family in the ordinary sense, no fortune. He had given away every possible future except this one. One thing he had not given away: Dawn. The Lord Commander had made no objection. A man does not object to a sacred sword. It hung at his right hip as it always had, pale and patient, and the arming sword rode his left, and he was the only knight of the Kingsguard who came to his vows already armed with 2 blades and the reputation to justify both of them. Sir Barristan Selmy came to him afterward in the yard, while the morning light was still fresh, and clasped his forearm in the manner of knights. Selmy was a few years older, steady-eyed and quiet, with the self-contained quality of a man who had long since made his peace with his own choices. "It gets easier," Selmy said, "and then it gets harder again." "What does?" "All of it," Selmy said, and left him there with the white cloak pooling around him on the stone. He served for years in contentment, or something close enough to it that he did not bother examining the difference. He protected the king, who was brilliant and erratic and increasingly prone to cruelties that required their witnesses to find, somewhere within themselves, a compartment that could be sealed. He rode in tourneys and was unhorsed by no man. He trained in the yards and found among the other knights of the Kingsguard a fellowship of quiet competence. The gap between what he had expected and what he found was something he felt, but was not yet prepared to name. He had imagined a court of honor. He found a court of performance, of men and women managing a king who had grown less manageable each year, of obligations arranged in careful order to avoid the question of what they were actually obliging you to do. He had imagined service as a clarifying thing, a life stripped to its essentials. He found that service, when given to the wrong thing, accumulated weight rather than removing it. He told himself this was the difficulty of the work, which was different from the work being wrong. He told himself he had made his choice, and the choice was honorable, and the vow was real, and the white cloak meant what it had always meant. He told himself this with the persistence of a man who is not quite sure he believes it, but is not yet ready to stop trying. Rhaegar he loved, in the way that a man can love another man when both are devoted to excellences of different kinds, the sword and the harp, the body and the mind. They were of an age and had come to their respective callings with the same intensity. Rhaegar was gentle, learned, a man who wept at the music he composed and treated servants with the same grave courtesy he showed to lords. Arthur had believed in him with the particular faith of a young man who needs something to believe in, and Rhaegar had seemed, in those early years, to justify the faith. Then there was Ashara. Ashara. She was his sister, 1 year his younger, which had meant something in childhood. The small gap of a year felt wider when one of you could already read and the other could not, when one of you knew how to ride and the other was still learning to sit a horse without listing, and had meant progressively less as they grew into the adjacency of adult siblings. By the time he came to court, she arrived not long after, establishing herself as one of the Queen's ladies with the natural ease of someone the court had been waiting for without knowing it, and the single year between them had narrowed to something entirely imperceptible. She was, by any honest accounting, the most remarkable person he had ever known who was not trying to kill him. She was brilliant and warm and wickedly perceptive, with a quality of attention that made its recipient feel both seen and understood, which is rarer than people suppose. She had their father's gray eyes and their mother's darkness, and she moved through the court the way a river moves through country, not imposing itself on the landscape so much as defining it, making everything else organize itself relative to her presence. He had always understood that Ashara's brightness cost her something, though it had taken him years to understand what. When she was 15, their mother had climbed to the top of the Palestone Sword Tower, that same seaward tower where generations of Danes had gone to watch the ships come in, and thrown herself into the sea below. They had found the body on the rocks at dawn. There had been no note, no explanation, only the absence of a woman who had been present and then was not, and the two of them left to go on without her. Arthur 16, Ashara 15, and the particular silence that fills a house after something that cannot be named has happened in it. He had never spoken to Ashara about it directly. She had never spoken to him. It was the first thing he had understood, without being told, was not to be discussed, not because their father forbade it, but because Ashara herself had closed the door on it with a completeness and a grace that he had not had the words to challenge. She had wept in private once that he knew of. Then she had stood up and resumed being Ashara, warm, sharp, entirely herself, the room-filling person she had always been. If the brightness in her cost something extra after that, if there was a quality of effort underneath what looked effortless, he had been the only one in a position to notice, and he had noticed and said nothing, because she had not wanted him to say anything. He understood it differently now at court, watching her work. The precision she brought to laughing at the king's jests, the care with which she positioned herself near exits, the way she gathered information about a room before committing herself to any corner of it. These were skills. They were not skills people were born with. He understood where she had begun to develop them, in a house that had fallen silent around a thing that could not be spoken, and what it had cost her to bring them to this level of refinement. At Starfall, she had been the kind of person who filled a room simply by being present in it, not through loudness or performance, but through a quality of aliveness that made other people more awake. He had grown up in the warmth of it, taken it for granted the way children took for granted anything that had always been there, and it was only at court, watching her in a new context, that he understood it for what it was. But something was wrong. It took him months to name it and longer still to be sure. The warmth was there when she looked at him, when they walked in the gardens or sat together at the less formal feasts, the easy companionship of two people who had grown up knowing each other's worst stories. When they were alone, or near to it, she was still herself. Everywhere else she was not. He noticed it first at a small supper in the king's solar, when Aerys made a remark that any man at the table would have called harmless, one of the king's increasingly frequent observations about the ladies of the court, delivered with the crooked smile he had developed in recent years, the smile that was half leer and half dare, as if testing how far he could go before someone would have the poor manners to object. It was not the worst thing the king had said that month, or that week. The court had learned to find these remarks unremarkable. Ashara laughed. It was a correct laugh, the kind that told the king he had been amusing without inviting more, the kind that required a certain precision to produce. And then she looked at her wine cup, and the laugh was gone from her face as if it had never been, and Arthur saw what was underneath it. He knew that expression. He had seen it before, on the faces of men after battles, when the fighting was done and the shaking started. He had seen it on Oswell once, after a particularly unpleasant royal command had been carried out. It was the expression of a person doing what was required and paying a cost for it that they could not show. He began watching more carefully after that. What he found, watching carefully, was a picture he did not want to see. The king had always been attentive to beautiful women in ways that were unbecoming a married man and a king. This was known, tolerated, part of the court's wallpaper. But attentive had become something else in recent months, something with sharper edges and less pretense of gallantry. He saw the king's hand on Ashara's arm, holding a moment too long. He saw the way she laughed at his jests with the precision of a woman calculating exactly how much was required. He saw the way she positioned herself in rooms, always near the queen or near another lady, never quite alone, always with an exit available. He could not ask her directly. There was no direct way to ask. She would deny it or minimize it or tell him there was nothing to be done. All of which might be true and none of which would be sufficient. He was a knight of the king's guard. His oath was to the king. The architecture of his obligations had been constructed, by his own choices, in a way that made certain protections impossible. He was the finest sword in the Seven Kingdoms, and he stood in the corridor outside the king's solar, and listened to the laughter inside and felt, for the first time in his life, entirely helpless. He said nothing to her. She said nothing to him. But she looked at him, sometimes, across a feast hall or a garden, with a look that said she knew he had noticed, and that she was grateful he was there even if there was nothing either of them could do, and that the gratitude itself was a kind of grief. He carried this with him in the years at court, a weight that sat beneath all the other weights, the vow, the duty, the service, like a stone at the bottom of deep water. It was the thing that most clearly told him what the vow had cost, not the sword, not the land, not the family he would not have. This, that he was the best swordsman alive and he could not protect his own sister from the man he had sworn to serve, and there was no answer to that which was not also a betrayal of something else he had sworn. Once, in the corridor outside the queen's chambers, she stopped him with a hand on his arm and looked at him with an expression he could not name. "Are you happy, Arthur?" she asked. He considered it with more seriousness than the question perhaps warranted. "I am where I am meant to be," he said at last. She looked at him a little longer. "That is not an answer," she said, and walked on. He watched her go and thought, not for the first time, that she was right. IV the Kingswood. The Kingswood Brotherhood had been operating in the forest south of King's, landing for the better part of a year, when the king finally directed the Kingsguard to deal with them. They were not, by the standards of the realm's catalogue of threats, an extraordinary danger. A band of outlaws, skilled ones, led by men of genuine ability, with enough popular support among the small folk to make them difficult to hunt and more difficult to catch. They robbed merchants on the roads through the forest. They killed crowned soldiers when cornered. They had given themselves romantic names and a romantic cause, which was the cause of the small folk against the lords, and the small folk of the Kingswood had decided to find this sympathetic in the way that people who were hungry and poorly treated tended to find such things sympathetic. Arthur understood the appeal, which did not make it his business to sympathize with it. He had his orders. He rode into the Kingswood at the head of a company of knights and soldiers with the specific intention of ending the brotherhood, and he set about it with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that complicated problems yielded best to simple approaches applied consistently. What he had not expected was the boy. Jaime Lannister was 15 years old that summer, and had come to the Kingswood campaign with a letter from his father and a quality of barely contained energy that reminded Arthur, in its particular brightness, of something he could not immediately place. He was tall for his age, already nearly the height he would reach as a man, with the Lannister coloring and a face that had not yet settled into whatever it was going to be, and he moved through the camp with the unconscious ease of someone who had grown up being told he was exceptional and had not yet had sufficient reason to doubt it. He was there because Tywin Lannister had arranged it. A son of 15 needed seasoning, and a campaign against forest outlaws was exactly the kind of low-stakes engagement that produced seasoned knights rather than dead boys. Arthur had seen this calculation before. He accepted the boy's presence without enthusiasm and assigned him to the rearguard, and expected to hear very little from him. He heard quite a lot from him. Jaime Lannister had opinions. He had them about tactics, about the terrain, about the Brotherhood's probable routes of retreat based on a reading of the forest floor that was, Arthur had to admit, more accurate than most of the seasoned scouts had managed. He expressed these opinions with the particular combination of certainty and deference that characterized someone who was right about something and knew it, but had enough intelligence to understand that being right, while young, was a complicated social position to occupy. Arthur listened. He did not do this for everyone. He did it here because the boy's reading of the ground turned out to be correct, twice running, and a man who was right twice was worth hearing out a third time. The decisive engagement happened 3 weeks into the campaign, in a narrow defile where the trees grew close and the Brotherhood had chosen to make a stand. They had chosen well. The ground favored defense, the sight lines were short, and they had numbers enough to hold the defile against a direct assault. Arthur had been considering the tactical problem for the better part of an hour when Jaime appeared at his elbow. "There's a way through the ridge," the boy said. He was not asking. He was reporting with the flat directness of someone who had been over the ground and come back with information. "A deer path, about a quarter-mile east, narrow but passable for men on foot. If you send a party round the back while the main force holds the defile, they'll have nowhere to run." Arthur looked at him. He looked at the defile. He thought about the alternatives, which were a direct assault that would cost men he could not easily spare, or a siege of a position that the Brotherhood could abandon through a dozen gaps in the tree line. "Show me," he said. The deer path was exactly as described. Arthur sent Jaime with 20 men to take the ridge while the main force held the defile's mouth, and what followed was brief and decisive, not clean. There was nothing clean about close fighting in trees, but brief. The Brotherhood broke. Their leaders were taken or killed. The small folk of the Kingswood would miss them for a season and then adapt, as small folk always adapted. Afterward, in the camp where the fires were burning, and the men were eating, and the particular quiet of a completed engagement settled over everything, Arthur found Jaime cleaning his sword with the careful attention of a boy who had been taught to treat a blade with respect, and had understood why. He had fought well. Not brilliantly, not with the particular instinctive genius that Arthur recognized in himself and had occasionally seen in others, but with sound technique and the kind of steadiness under pressure that was rarer and in some ways more valuable. He had not frozen. He had not shown off. He had done what was required and done it in the service of the people around him. And 2 of the 20 men who had taken the ridge were alive because of decisions Jaime had made in the space of a few seconds. Arthur sat down beside him. The boy looked up with the particular wariness of someone who expected to receive instruction, and had not yet learned to distinguish instruction from praise. "You fought well today," Arthur said. Jaime absorbed this. He seemed for a moment to be deciding how to respond to something he had not expected. "The plan worked," he said, which was a careful answer, neither false modesty nor unearned pride. "Plans work when the men executing them make good decisions under pressure," Arthur said. "The plan was sound. The execution required something else." He looked at the boy's face for a moment. "Kneel." Jaime blinked. Then he set down his sword and his cloth and knelt in the firelit grass, and Arthur placed the flat of his blade on each of the boys' shoulders in turn, and the old words were spoken, and Sir Jaime Lannister rose at 15 years old with an expression that was trying very hard not to be as moved as it was and not quite succeeding. He was a Lannister. He had been told his whole life that he was exceptional. He had probably expected to be knighted young. But expecting a thing and having it done to you by Arthur Dayne in a forest after a battle were different things, and Arthur could see in the boys' face the understanding of that difference arriving, quietly, for the first time. "Sir Jaime," Arthur said. He said it the way the title deserved to be said, with the weight that came from meaning it. Jaime Lannister looked at him. In his face, for one unguarded moment, was the expression of a young man who had just been given something real and understood, perhaps also for the first time, what real things cost. "Thank you," he said. It was simply said, which was the right way to say it. Arthur nodded and stood and went back to his own fire, and he thought, there is something in that boy. Something that could be a great deal if it is treated correctly, and almost nothing if it is not. He did not know, then, which way it would go. He thought it could go either way. He thought it was not yet decided. He thought the white cloak would be a complicated thing for a man like that to carry. He filed this thought in the place he kept observations that were not yet conclusions, and he did not revisit it for several years, and by the time he did, events had moved past the point where the observation was useful. The Prince and the Sword. He had known Rhaegar Targaryen for 6 years before Harrenhal, and the man he had known in those years was not the man he watched at the tournament. This was the thing that made Harrenhal so unsettling, not that Rhaegar had changed, but that Arthur could trace the change now in retrospect with a clarity that had not been available to him while it was happening. He could see exactly where the road had bent. He had simply not been looking at the road. He had been looking at Rhaegar, which was a different thing, and what he had seen in Rhaegar had been so compelling that the road had not seemed worth examining. In the beginning, in the first years, when Arthur had come to court at 17, and Rhaegar had been 16, and the dynasty had still seemed like something that deserved the white cloak he wore, Rhaegar had been the kind of person who made everyone in his proximity feel that the world was a more serious and more beautiful place than they had previously understood. He was not warm in the easy way of men who had been taught to be charming, but he was attentive in a way that felt like a gift. When Rhaegar looked at you, he was looking at you, and what he saw was what was actually there rather than what he expected to see. He read constantly, which Arthur had never done with the same appetite, and he was generous with what he found. He would appear in the training yard with a passage from some old chronicle, and read it aloud with the specific pleasure of someone who had just found something worth sharing. And Arthur, who had grown up in Starfall with a respect for learning but not a love of it, had found himself listening with attention he had not expected to bring. Rhaegar read the way he did everything else, completely, with his whole attention, treating the dead authors as if they were people worth arguing with. He played the harp, which Arthur had no aptitude for and no particular interest in, but had sat and listened to in the evenings more times than he could count, because there was something about watching Rhaegar play that was difficult to look away from. Not the music itself, though the music was extraordinary. He had reduced men to silence and women to tears with nothing but strings and his long fingers and his absolute presence in the doing of it. It was the quality of surrender he brought to it, the complete absence of performance, the sense of a man doing something entirely for itself and not for anyone watching. It was, Arthur thought much later, the quality he had most admired in Rhaegar, the ability to be inside a thing rather than above it, observing. They trained together, which was Rhaegar's idea, and which Arthur had agreed to with the mild curiosity he brought to any challenge. He had not expected much. Rhaegar's reputation with a sword was solid, better than most men who wore swords would ever be, and he trained with the same discipline he brought to everything else. Arthur had expected to be impressed and to find himself, in the way of a man who has already found his ceiling, looking at someone who had nearly found theirs. What he found was more complicated. Rhaegar was good, genuinely good, not the flattering good of a prince whose sparring partners had learned not to embarrass him, but the real good of a man who had spent years in honest practice and had arrived at a quality of swordsmanship that would have made him formidable against almost anyone else in the Seven Kingdoms. His footwork was excellent. His timing was sound. He read an opponent's intentions with a quickness that Arthur recognized as native ability rather than trained skill, which was harder to develop and harder to counter. He was not better than Arthur. He was not close to better than Arthur. The gap between them was, in Arthur's private assessment, considerable, not in the way of two men separated by training or technique, but in the way of a man looking at a river and a man looking at the sea. They were the same category of thing. The scale was simply different. Arthur did not show this. He had understood, in the first week of their training, that showing it would cost something he did not want to pay. Not that Rhaegar would have been angry. He was not a petty man about his abilities, had the self-awareness to understand that there were things he could not do and the generosity not to resent those who could. But there was a quality to the way Rhaegar engaged with their sessions, a quality of belief in his own considerable competence that was doing useful work in his life. It was part of what made him willing to take Arthur seriously, to see him as a peer rather than a weapon. And Arthur had needed that, had needed in those years someone who saw him as a person rather than a function. So he adjusted. Not much, not in a way that would have been obvious to a careful observer, and Rhaegar was a careful observer. He allowed openings that he would have closed in anyone else. He committed to lines of attack a fraction later than he might have. He won their sessions at a ratio that felt, from Rhaegar's side, like the natural friction between two men of comparable but not identical ability, one of whom had a slight edge. He lost enough that Rhaegar's confidence remained intact. He won enough that the sessions remained genuinely useful to both of them. He told himself he was being kind. He probably was. He was also, he understood much later, making a choice that prevented Rhaegar from ever having an accurate picture of where he stood, and an accurate picture of where he stood might have told him something useful. They spoke about everything those years. History, philosophy, music, the question of what a knight owed his king and what a king owed his kingdom, and at what point the accounting between the two became irreconcilable. They argued about the old kings, about Aegon the Conqueror, whose accomplishment Rhaegar admired without quite admiring the method, and about the Targaryens of the decline, whose failures Rhaegar catalogued with the brisk efficiency of a man doing forensic work on a problem he intended to avoid. He was preparing himself for something. Arthur could see it. He was studying kingship the way a carpenter studied wood, not out of theoretical interest, but because he intended to work with it. He was going to be a good king. Arthur had believed this with the completeness of a man who had no particular reason to doubt it and several reasons to hope for it. He had watched the way Rhaegar managed the small folk who came before his father's court, the patience he brought to petitions that the king had long since stopped finding interesting, the quality of attention he gave to problems that did not affect him personally and whose resolution would profit him nothing. He had watched him grieve genuinely when news came of famine in the Reach or plague in the Stormlands. He was not performing compassion. He felt it. He simply also felt everything else, the music, the books, the long conversations, the sense that the world was a place of extraordinary depth and meaning if you only looked at it with sufficient care. Arthur had loved him. He had loved him the way you loved a man who had shown you that seriousness and delight were not opposites, who had been, in those early years, the best argument available for what the white cloak was supposed to mean. Then Rhaegar found the prophecy. It did not happen all at once. Arthur could identify, in retrospect, the moment the balance had begun to shift. The evening Rhaegar had brought him a scroll from Asshai, and read aloud a passage about the promised prince with the quality of expression Arthur had only previously heard from him when he played the harp, that quality of a man making contact with something that had been waiting for him. He had looked up from the scroll and said nothing, which was itself unusual. And Arthur had said nothing either, because there was nothing in the passage itself that required comment. It was just an old prophecy, and the world was full of old prophecies, and he had not yet understood that this one was going to become a mirror in which Rhaegar would see only himself. That had been 2 years before Harrenhal. By the tournament, the mirror was the only thing Rhaegar looked into. Part 2, The Dragon's Delusion. VI. Harrenhal. The years between the Kingswood and Harrenhal were quiet ones for the realm, if not entirely quiet ones for Arthur. He was 17 when he took his vows and 23 when he rode to Harrenhal, which meant 6 years of service behind him and a quality of competence that had stopped developing in the sense of improving and had begun developing in the sense of deepening. He served. He stood watch. He rode in tournaments and remained unhorsed. He trained in yards across the 7 kingdoms and found, without particular surprise, that there was no one left who could teach him anything he had not already learned. The knowledge had simply outrun the available instruction, and what remained was the slow accumulation of refinement, the 1,000 small improvements that separated good from very good and very good from something that had no adequate name. He watched Jaime Lannister join the Kingsguard at 15 and said nothing about it, because there was nothing useful to say. The boy was good enough, would become better than good, Arthur thought, with time and the right circumstances. Whether the white cloak would provide the right circumstances was a different question. He served Rhaegar, who was becoming something Arthur watched with increasing unease, not the man he had been, but a version of that man turned inward, the scholar's breadth giving way to the zealot's focus. The books on prophecy, the quiet certainty growing in his eyes. Arthur noted it and filed it and told himself it was a phase, and knew as he told himself this that he was being the kind of man who watches a slow flood and does not move his furniture. And then there was Harrenhal. Arthur Dayne rode to the great tournament at Harrenhal in his 23rd year. which was also the year that everything that had been building quietly in the realm finally broke the surface and began, with terrible patience, to drown it. Harrenhal was a ruin made into a spectacle, its halls patched, and its towers propped, and its vast scorched stones hung with banners of all the great houses of Westeros, as if finery could conceal the char beneath. The tournament drew 20,000 people, and it was, by every external measure, the most magnificent gathering of knights and lords and ladies the realm had seen in a generation. Arthur thought it was also, though he could not yet say why, one of the most dangerous. On the second night of the great tournament feast, Jaime Lannister appeared beside him with 2 cups of wine, and the look of a man who intended conversation, whether invited or not. He was 17 now, 2 years in the White Cloak, 2 years past the Kingswood, and he had grown into his height with the easy physicality of a man who was comfortable in his body and knew it. He was, without question, the most handsome man in the hall that evening, which was a quality he wore with the particular nonchalance of someone who had been told this so many times that it had ceased to function as information. "Sir Arthur," he held out one of the cups. Arthur took it. "Sir Jaime." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, which was the specific silence of 2 men who shared a profession and a certain quality of watchfulness, and did not need to perform either of them for each other's benefit. Then Jaime's gaze moved across the hall and came to rest, with the unhurried appreciation of a connoisseur, on Ashara. She was in conversation with one of the Tully ladies, laughing at something, the real laugh rather than the court laugh, the one that reached her eyes and changed the whole quality of her face. She was 22 years old and wearing something in pale green that caught the torchlight, and she was, by any objective measure, the most striking woman in the hall. "Your sister," Jaime said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "Yes," Arthur said. Jaime was quiet for a moment, watching her with the frank assessment of a young man who had not yet learned to make that assessment less visible. Then a particular quality of amusement crossed his face, the look of a man about to say something he knows is slightly too much and has decided to say it anyway. "It must be difficult," he said, "growing up with a woman like that in the next room and being required to simply be her brother." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one that had preceded it. Arthur set down his wine cup. He turned to look at Jaime with the full attention he usually reserved for opponents, which had the effect of making most people reconsider whatever they had just said. Jaime met his gaze without flinching, which was characteristic of him, but something shifted in his expression, a recognition that he had miscalculated the distance between amusing and offensive and had come down on the wrong side of it. "That was poorly said," Arthur told him. "It was," Jaime agreed, with the directness that was. Arthur had come to understand the best quality the boy possessed. He did not argue when he was wrong. "I apologize." Arthur looked at him for a moment longer. He thought about what it would cost to press the point further, and decided the cost was higher than the benefit. The apology had been genuine. The joke had been thoughtless rather than malicious, and thoughtlessness in a young man was a correctable condition, where malice was not. He retrieved his wine cup. He said nothing more about it. But he thought, as he looked back across the hall to where Ashara was still laughing with the Tully lady, that there was something in the way Jaime had looked at her that was not quite the way a man looked at a woman he found beautiful. There was something more complicated in it, something that looked, in the small glimpse Arthur had caught before the shutters came down, almost like grief. He filed this too, in the place he kept things that were not yet conclusions. Later that same evening he caught sight of Ashara on the floor with a young lord he did not immediately recognize, dark-haired, northern by his look, perhaps 20 years old, with the careful, serious quality of someone who had been taught to take things seriously and had obliged. He watched them for a moment before placing the face. Eddard Stark, Robert's foster brother, the second Stark son. Not a name that carried particular weight. The firstborn Brandon was the one everyone watched, the one with the reputation and the loud charm that preceded him into rooms. Eddard was quieter. Quieter was apparently not a problem for Ashara. She was laughing, the real laugh, the one Arthur had known since they were children, the one that meant she had been genuinely surprised into it rather than performing amusement. The Stark was saying something. She was arguing back. He could see it in her posture, the slight lean forward, the hands moving in the way they moved when she was engaged rather than managing. She looked, in short, like herself, the version of herself that had become harder to find at court in recent years, the version he had started to miss without nomming the missing. Arthur watched them for a moment longer than was strictly necessary and then looked away. She was allowed to enjoy herself. She had earned it, and if Eddard Stark was the occasion for it, that was not his business and not his concern. He filed this also. He was becoming a very thorough archivist of things that were not his business. Robert Baratheon he watched from a different angle. He had known Robert for years. You could not be at court and not know Robert, who was the loudest and largest and most energetically present man in any room he entered, and he had formed the opinion, arrived at gradually but held with some confidence, that Robert was not quite what he appeared to be. The reputation was for appetite, for excess, for the careless pursuit of women and wine and the next exciting thing. The reputation was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete. In Arthur's observation, Robert Baratheon was a man of genuine feeling who had never been taught to manage it, which led him toward the behaviors that generated the reputation, which in turn made people miss the feeling underneath. At Harrenhal, watching Robert watch Lyanna Stark, Arthur saw the feeling underneath with unusual clarity. It was not the way Robert looked at serving girls, or the merchants' daughters who found their way to the feasts, or any of the women whose company he sought and discarded with the cheerful indifference of appetite satisfied and moved on from. This was different. This was the look of a man who had found, in the particular bright energy of one particular person, something he had not expected to find and did not entirely know what to do with. He was nervous around her. Robert Baratheon, who was afraid of nothing, was nervous around Lyanna Stark, not trembling, not tongue-tied, but careful in a way Arthur had never seen him be careful before. Studying his words before he said them, watching her face when she laughed to see if he had made her laugh, or if she was simply herself. She was not indifferent to him. That much was also visible, to a man who had learned to read the small information of bodies and faces. She watched him when he was not watching her, with a quality of attention that was not quite longing but not quite nothing either. She was betrothed to him and had been since she was a child, and Arthur supposed that somewhere in the years of growing up she had arrived at something more than mere resignation about it, had found, perhaps, the beginning of something she was not ready to name. Arthur had seen Lyanna Stark before at court, briefly, the betrothed of Robert Baratheon. She was 17 years old, dark-haired, gray-eyed, with a quality of compressed energy that made her seem, in any room, like the most alive person in it. She did not simper. She argued. She laughed too loudly and sat her horse too well for a highborn girl and made no particular effort to be what highborn girls were expected to be. He liked her, in the absent way of a man who does not permit himself too many attachments. She reminded him, in some quality of fundamental self-possession, of Ashara, though where Ashara's brightness had become a careful, managed thing at court, Lyanna was still entirely her own. He noticed Rhaegar noticing her, and he told himself it meant nothing. He had said that about other things at Harrenhal, and he had been wrong about all of them. The joust between Rhaegar and Arthur was the bout the crowds had ridden days to see. They rode against each other on the 5th afternoon, and the stands went quiet in the particular way stands went quiet when something they had been promised was finally being delivered. Arthur settled into the saddle and felt the familiar weight of the lance in his hand, and looked down the field at the prince's colors and thought about what was required of him. He was the better rider. He had always been the better rider, and Rhaegar knew it, and the people who had trained them both knew it, and there was not a man in the field who would have placed money on any other outcome if asked honestly and in private. The prince was competent, genuinely competent, trained well, with the long reach and natural athleticism of a man made for the lance. In another tournament against another opponent, he would have been worth watching. He was not riding against another opponent. He was riding against Arthur Dayne. Arthur let the angle close a fraction too slowly. He let his lance drift a hand's width wide in the final stride, the correction that would have been there in any other bout arriving just too late. Rhaegar's lance struck true, and Arthur went backward off his horse with the complete physical commitment of a man who had decided to fall, and was going to fall well, convincingly, cleanly, without the stiffness of a performance. He lay on his back in the churned earth and looked at the sky, and the crowd roared above him, and he thought, "This is what the vow has made of me, not a knight, a prop in someone else's story." He mounted his horse and rode off the field with his expression composed, and his thoughts sealed away in the place he kept things he was not ready to examine, and he received the congratulations of his brothers in the Kingsguard with the measured courtesy that was required, and he said nothing to anyone about what had happened, because there was nothing to say that would not cost more than staying silent. Later that day, he watched Rhaegar accept the champion's crown of blue winter roses from the tournament master. The prince held the wreath for a long moment, looking at it, and something moved through his face that Arthur recognized, the particular expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he already believed about himself. Then Rhaegar walked his horse along the line of the watching ladies, past his wife, past Elia Martell of Dorne, the princess who had borne him 2 children and who watched now with a stillness that required considerable effort to maintain. Elia was composed and gracious, and she was the mother of Rhaegar's daughter Rhaenys and of his son Aegon, a boy not yet 2 years old who was at that moment presumably asleep in the nursery of Harrenhal's great keep. She watched her husband ride past her with the crown of flowers in his hand, and she did not allow her face to change. Rhaegar stopped his horse before Lyanna Stark. He placed the crown of blue winter roses in her lap and named her the Queen of Love and Beauty. The silence that followed was of the kind that precedes an event rather than follows one. Arthur looked at Elia's face, and he looked at the faces of the lords around him, and he looked at Lyanna Stark, who was staring down at the flowers with an expression that was not pleasure, whatever the crowd chose to believe. Then he looked at Robert Baratheon. Robert stood at the edge of the field with his hands very still at his sides, and what was in his face was the expression of a man who has just watched something be taken from him by someone with no right to it. Not a thing he had possessed, but a thing he had been growing toward, a thing he had believed, privately and without quite admitting it, was already in some sense his. It was not the expression of a man who had given up. Arthur filed all of it away in the place where he kept things he could not act on and could not forget, and he rode back to his quarters, and he did not sleep well that night. He had not slept well for several days, if he was honest about it. The tournament had provided Rhaegar with too many opportunities to be himself in public, and what Rhaegar was becoming in public was something Arthur was finding difficult to watch. It was not any single thing. It was the accumulation of small moments that, viewed separately, could each be dismissed as eccentricity or pride, but which assembled into something else when you held them together. There had been the exchange with Lord Wen on the second morning, when Rhaegar had made an observation about the tournament's timing arranged by Wen himself, who was Oswell's uncle, and the observation had contained, beneath its surface, something that was not an observation at all, but a statement of gratitude for a plan that had unfolded as intended. Wen had gone still, the specific stillness of a man who had just been acknowledged for something that was not supposed to be acknowledged. And Rhaegar had moved on before anyone else had quite caught it. There had been the comment at the feast on the third night, when someone had asked about the significance of the blue winter roses, a jest, half-drunk and good-natured, and Rhaegar had said, with the gentle patience of someone explaining the obvious, "There are flowers that belong to summer, and flowers that belong to winter. Some of us know which season we stand in." He had said it pleasantly, with no change in his manner, and the man who had asked had laughed uncertainly and changed the subject, and Arthur had sat with the sentence afterward and found that the more he examined it, the more it smelled like prophecy. There had been a moment in the yard when a young squire had made some passing remark about the world changing, a commonplace observation, the kind anyone made, and Rhaegar had put his hand on the boy's shoulder and looked at him directly and said, "You have no idea." The boy had been briefly frightened. Arthur had seen it. Rhaegar had moved away without noticing. These things were individually small. Together they described a man who was living in a story the rest of the room could not see, who had the absolute settled confidence of someone who knew the ending and was patiently allowing the rest of the world to catch up. Arthur did not know what to do with this. He did not have the language for it yet, though he was beginning to develop one. Rhaegar was 22 that year at Harrenhal, and already the change that had been building in him for the past year had completed itself in ways Arthur had not quite registered, until he saw the prince at the feast on the fifth night and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man recognizing something he has been trying not to see, that this was no longer a phase of scholarly temperament. The prince had always read. Books were Rhaegar's truest country. He lived in them more fully than he lived in the world, and he had never made a secret of it. But there had always been a quality of balance to his scholarship, a range of interests that encompassed music and history and philosophy in equal measure. In the year before Harrenhal, the range had narrowed. Arthur noticed the titles when he caught glimpses of the books on the prince's table, prophecies mostly, texts on Azor Ahai, the scrolls of Ashai, translations of old Valyrian verses on the last hero, and the darkness that was said to come before the dawn. He had not thought much of it at first. Rhaegar had always had a scholarly bent toward the mystical. It was only at Harrenhal, watching the prince at the feast on the third night, that Arthur began to understand that what he was seeing was not scholarship but conviction, the specific, settled conviction of a man who had found in ancient texts the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. The question Arthur would come to understand was, "Who am I?" And on that night, the answer Rhaegar had arrived at was, the dragon from the prophecy, the one that will bring the promised prince into the world. A man who believes himself chosen by fate is a different creature from a man who merely hopes he is capable. Arthur had known Rhaegar for 6 years by then, and he watched this creature from across the feast hall with a tightness behind his sternum that he recognized, dimly, as fear. On the last night of the tournament, the night that the music played too long and the wine flowed too freely, and the candles burned down to their sockets while lords and ladies drank to Rhaegar's crown of blue winter roses, he saw Robert lean down and say something in Lyanna's ear. He offered his hand and she took it, and they slipped away from the feasting together, quiet and private, into whatever that night had to offer them. He said nothing about it. It was not his to say. VII, the 7 months. The disappearance happened just over a month after Harrenhal, in the Riverlands. Lyanna Stark had traveled west to attend her brother Brandon's wedding at Riverrun, and she had arrived there and then she was gone. No one had seen her leave. There was one account, a stable hand, who said he had seen two men on horseback in the woods outside Riverrun, one of which had silver hair, riding away with a screaming girl. There was no proof. There was never any proof. But there did not need to be proof for a family like the Starks to know what had happened, and there did not need to be proof for the news to travel north to Winterfell. And when Rhaegar was also absent from King's Landing, had been absent, it turned out, since shortly after Harrenhal, slipping away with no announcement, the absence of proof began to feel very much like proof. He knew or suspected Rhaegar had been involved. He knew this because of Oswell Went. Oswell had been at Harrenhal. Oswell had been, in the weeks before Rhaegar's disappearance, in conversation with the prince that stopped when Arthur entered the room. Oswell had departed the Red Keep on the same morning as Rhaegar, or perhaps the morning before, or the morning after. The accounts were not consistent, and Arthur had not been watching with enough attention to be certain. What he was certain of was that Oswell was also gone, and that the particular shape of his absence had the quality of a man who had chosen it rather than fallen into it. He also suspected that Gerald Hightower knew more than he was saying. The Lord Commander had been behaving in those weeks with the particular careful stillness of a man who has been told something he has not passed on. Once, after one of Oswell's longer absences, Arthur had glimpsed the two of them in the corridor outside the small council chamber, speaking quietly, their heads closed together in the manner of men exchanging something they did not want overheard. Oswell had disappeared again within a few days. Hightower had said nothing to anyone, or nothing that Arthur was aware of, and had carried his Lord Commander's composure through everything that followed as though it were made of stone. He did not ask questions. He told himself he did not ask questions because there were no questions with acceptable answers. Because, whatever Rhaegar had done, the asking of certain questions would require him to do something with the information, and there was no version of that doing which did not end in catastrophe. He told himself this in the way a man told himself things that were partially true and partially the shape of the truth he was able to live with. Then Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing. He came with a small party and a louder voice than his situation warranted, and he stood in the outer court of the Red Keep, and he demanded the return of his sister. He was young, perhaps 22 or near it, with the dark Stark coloring and the absolute certainty of a man who had been wronged, and was not yet experienced enough to know how wronged a man could be. He demanded an audience with the prince. He demanded justice. He said, in terms that left no room for diplomatic interpretation, exactly what he believed Rhaegar Targaryen to be. The king had him arrested. Arthur stood on the gallery above the outer court and watched this happen and felt the sealed compartment in his chest, the one where he kept things he could not act on, fill up a little more. He was the sword of the morning. He was a knight of the Kingsguard. He had sworn an oath to protect the king, and the king was having an unarmed young lord seized in his own courtyard for the crime of speaking the truth too loudly, and there was nothing Arthur Dayne could do about any of it that would not cost more than silence. He stood on the gallery and he watched and he did nothing, and the weight of it settled into the same place as all the other weights, and he set his teeth and bore it. Rickard Stark came to the king 2 days later, with the kind of desperation you have only when a child is in danger. He came to the Red Keep with letters, and with the names of allies, and with the measured formal language of a man attempting to resolve a situation through proper channels before it became something that could not be resolved that way. The king burned him alive in the throne room. He burned him in his armor with a rope around his neck that he could not reach and a fire underneath him that he could not escape, and he made Brandon Stark watch, with a sword placed just outside his reach. The king found this amusing. Brandon was then executed where he was standing. Arthur stood in the corridor outside the throne room and heard the sounds that came through the door, and he did not go in because he had not been summoned, and because he had taken a vow, and the vow did not contain exceptions, and the compartment in his chest was full to capacity, and none of that was sufficient, and he knew it, and he stood there anyway. Among those present in the throne room that day was Jaime Lannister, 2 years in the White Cloak, young enough that the shine of it had barely had time to dull. Lord Tywin had arranged his presence in the Kingsguard partly to place a son close to power and partly because Jaime had wanted it, and Jaime had now been wearing the cloak long enough to understand what he had wanted, and whether the reality matched the wanting. From what Arthur had observed, the answer was not simple. Jaime had been white-faced through the whole of the throne room. The other Kingsguard present had managed their discomfort with the practiced blankness of men who had been managing the king's excesses for years. Jaime had not managed it. He had stood and watched, and his face had done everything his training had not yet taught him to prevent a face from doing. Arthur had heard about it afterward, and he had thought, the boy is being broken, or he is being made. He had not known then which it would be. The war began in earnest in the weeks after that. The realm took sides. The names arrived at court in fragments: Baratheon, Tully, Arryn, Stark, and what they assembled into was a coalition of houses that had looked at what the king had done and had decided, with the practical clarity of men who understood power, that this could not be allowed to stand. Robert Baratheon was its heart, which was appropriate. Robert had a great deal of feeling and a talent for war and a personal reason that sharpened both. For over 7 months, Arthur Dayne stood his post in King's Landing and watched the mad king burn men, and listened to the ravens bringing news of a war that was consuming the realm. And he had no knowledge of where Rhaegar was, and he told himself he had no knowledge because no one had told him, and he told himself he was not responsible for the uses to which that not knowing had been put. He was getting very good at telling himself things. VII, the tower. The note came through Oswell. He had not seen Oswell for over a month, when the man had slipped away from the Red Keep in the manner of someone who had somewhere more important to be. And then one morning, 7 months into the war, Oswell simply reappeared, standing in the corridor outside Arthur's chambers as if he had never left, looking travel-worn and carrying the particular composure of a man who had been doing something difficult and had made his peace with it. He held out a folded letter. He said nothing. He asked no questions. "I've come to take you back with me," Oswell said. "We ride today." Arthur took the letter and looked at it and looked at Oswell's face, and Oswell's face gave him nothing useful. He unfolded the paper. The message was in Rhaegar's hand. It was brief. It named a tower in the Dornish Hills in the Prince's Pass, a half-abandoned place that Arthur had ridden past once years ago and had noted only as a useful waypoint. It said, "Come when you are able." It said nothing else. Arthur stood in the corridor, and he looked at the note for a long time. He thought about the war. He thought about what had been done in the throne room. He thought about 7 months of absence and a girl who was missing and a family burned, and a realm split along the seams, and a prince who had apparently been sitting in a tower in the hills of Dorne while all of it happened, waiting to be able. He thought about his vow. He thought, "I am still a knight of the Kingsguard. I serve the prince as I serve the king. He has summoned me. I will go." He told himself this was duty. He was not yet entirely wrong. He folded the note and put it in his breast and went to saddle his horse, and Oswell fell into step beside him without being asked, and they rode south together that same afternoon. 2 men who had not spoken to each other in many months, riding toward something neither of them was yet prepared to name. They arrived at the tower 2 weeks later, having ridden south through the Dornish marches by roads that attracted no particular attention. The tower was as Arthur remembered it, a modest thing, old stone, half collapsed on one side, perched in a fold of the hills where the wind came cold off the mountains even in what passed for summer this far south. There was a yard and horses, and smoke from a chimney that meant occupation. Rhaegar was in the lower hall. He was changed. Arthur saw it in the first moment and spent the next hour understanding the nature of the change. The prince had always carried himself with the gravity of a man aware of his own significance. It was one of the qualities Arthur had loved in him, that weight, that sense of taking up the right amount of space and no more. That was still there. What had been added to it was something else, the absolute, unshakable composure of a man who had stopped doubting himself. The questions were gone. What remained was only certainty. "Sir Arthur," Rhaegar said, "I am glad you came." Arthur looked at the room. He looked at the lower hall, at the table with its maps and its candles and the evidence of occupation spread across it. He looked at the stairs that led upward, at the door at the top he could not see but whose existence he now knew. "My prince," he said, he kept his voice level, "the rumors are true then." "Lyanna Stark is here," Rhaegar said, the same way you might say the sun is out, a statement of a fact he had made peace with and did not expect to require defense. "She is with child, my child." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "My prince, the realm is at war, her family." "I know what has happened to her family," Rhaegar said. The warmth did not leave his voice precisely, it simply receded to a greater distance. "It is a tragedy, history will account for it. I could not account for it then and I cannot now. What I can account for is this." He moved to the table. He laid his hand on the papers there, old texts Arthur saw, the kind of papers that had been read and reread until they were soft at the folds. "I have been living inside these words for 3 years, Sir Arthur, not reading them, living in them, and I have seen it, the shape of what is coming, the darkness." Arthur looked at his prince and he thought, he believes this, every word of it. He has been sitting in this tower with his books and his certainty while the realm burned, and he believes every word. "The dragon and the wolf," Rhaegar said. His voice had the quality of a man reciting something he has memorized so thoroughly it has become part of him. "United, their child born of ice and fire both. Aegon, the prince that was promised, who will stand against the darkness when it comes. The long night is not legend, the others are not legend. I have read every account, every fragment, every scroll that the Citadel possesses and several that it does not. It is written. It has always been written." Arthur looked at the man he had served for 6 years. He looked at the prince he had loved. He looked at the prince who had apparently resolved whatever conflict might have existed between these facts by the simple mechanism of believing that the prophecy superseded them. Rhaegar's first son, Aegon, had been wrong. This Aegon would be right. History had a way, in Rhaegar's cosmology, of arranging itself to accommodate what was necessary. Arthur looked at the prince who sat in a tower in the hills, while 2 men had died in the throne room, and a realm had split apart around him, entirely at peace with the necessity of all of it. He thought, the prince sounds like the Mad King. He did not say this. I am going back, Rhaegar said. I have delayed long enough. Robert's rebellion must be answered, and I will answer it, and I will win, and then I will come back here, and the child will be born, and the realm will understand what was required of it. He looked at Arthur directly. I need you here. She is not to leave this tower. No one goes in and no one comes out. The child is what matters, protected at any cost, whatever comes. Arthur looked at him. The war is nearly at King's Landing's doorstep, he said. He kept his voice even but did not keep it quiet. I should be there with you when it arrives. Your men are fighting and dying in your name. Rhaegar's expression did not change. The warmth that had once been there in the early years was entirely absent now. What remained was only the certainty, the high untroubled certainty of a man who had decided he was right about everything. I will be there, he said. When the time comes, I will be there. But the child must be protected first. You are the finest sword in the realm, Sir Arthur. That is precisely why I need you here and not at the Trident. Arthur looked at him for a moment. He thought about what he wanted to say and the distance between that and what he was able to say, which was very large. He was conflicted. He stood in the lower hall of the Tower of Joy, and he was more deeply conflicted than he had been at any point in his adult life. He was a knight of the Kingsguard. He served the Crown Prince of the 7 Kingdoms. The Crown Prince had given him a direct order, and the order was clear, and the loyalty he had kept through 7 months of silence and 2 men burned alive in the throne room was a loyalty he had not yet run out of. He was not yet ready to run out of it. Yes, my prince, he said. Rhaegar nodded. He had not expected any other answer. Rhaegar left the next morning, taking Oswell went with him. He said nothing to Arthur about what had passed between them, beyond the orders already given. He looked at the tower one last time from horseback, and his face was the face of a man who believed, still, always to the end, that he was the center of a story the world did not yet understand. Do not let her leave, he said to Arthur very quietly from horseback. No one in and no one out. The child is everything. Protect it. Rhaegar rode toward the Trident. Oswell rode at his side. None of them looked back. Arthur stood in the yard alone. He watched the road until it was empty. Then he went inside and he stood at the foot of the stairs and he listened. And from the room above him he heard nothing. And after a while he went to tend the horses because the horses needed tending, and that was a thing he could do. What was kept. The door was chained from the outside. He had not chained it. It had been chained before he arrived, by Oswell, he supposed, or Rhaegar himself in the months before the summons. It was a heavy chain, padlocked at the staple. He stood before it that first morning and he looked at it for a long time. He had his orders. No one in and no one out. The child was everything. He had the padlocked door and the orders and Rhaegar's voice still in his ears, and he stood at the foot of those stairs and he thought about what the orders required. He kept the chain. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself it was temporary, only until he understood the situation, only until he had assessed whether she posed a risk of flight. She was 7.5 months along. She could barely walk. The chain was a precaution, not a cruelty. He told himself these things with the concentration of a man who knows that if he stops telling himself, he will have to look at what he is actually doing. He found, in short order, that the orders required him to feed her. This meant carrying a tray up the stairs and unlatching the chain and opening the door and setting the tray inside and relatching the door behind him. He also found that the orders required him to carry water up and to carry the waste bucket down and to keep the fire below supplied with wood so that the heat could rise and keep the upper room from the Dornish cold that came off the mountains at night. These were not the duties of a knight of the Kingsguard. They were the duties of a jailer. The words meant different things and arrived at the same place. She tried to speak to him through the door on the second day. Open it, she said. Her voice was low and flat, the flatness of someone who has been managing a situation for months and has run out of the energy to perform either anger or appeal. You can see I'm not going anywhere. I can barely stand. He did not open it. He set the tray down at the threshold and relatched the chain. On the third day she said, You're Arthur Dayne, aren't you? I remember you from the tourney. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. There was a pause. You let him win, she said. It was not a question. I watched the joust. I'd seen you in the yard the morning before. You let him win. He said nothing to that. Are you going to let him win this too? She asked. He latched the chain and went back down the stairs. On the fourth day she said, "I need to walk, I can't walk in this room." He opened his mouth to say no and found that what came out instead was a long silence in which he thought about the child. Rhaegar's child. The promised prince. The child required its mother to be healthy. He said, "Not yet," and then he closed his mouth before he said anything else. He thought about his orders for the rest of that day and the next. He knew it was wrong. He had known it was wrong from the moment he saw the chain and understood what it meant and kept it anyway. He had been doing a great deal of things he knew were wrong in the name of orders, and the accumulation of them was becoming something he was having difficulty looking directly at. 2 weeks into his vigil, he unlatched the chain. It was evening. He brought the tray up and he set it down and he looked at the padlock and he thought about the child. And he put the key in the lock and turned it and carried the chain away from the door and went downstairs and built up the fire in the lower hall. She came down an hour later, slowly, one step at a time, holding the wall. She was enormous in the way of a woman at the very end of her time, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone negotiating with their own body. She sat down in the chair nearest the fire and she did not look at him, and he did not look at her, and they were in the same room together for the first time. After a while he said, "You can come down in the evenings, not outside." She looked at the fire. "Not outside," she said. It was not agreement. It was the sound of a woman nodding the limits of what was on offer. "Those are my orders." "I know," she said. The flatness again. The flatness of someone who had been inside those orders for 7 months and understood their exact dimensions and was done being surprised by them. She came down every evening after that. They did not speak much at first. She watched him with the flat, careful eyes of a woman who had learned not to trust the intentions of men who were kind to her, and he accepted this and did not push against it. And gradually, the silence between them became a different quality of silence than it had been, less a wall and more a room they both occupied. She tried once more in the 3rd week to persuade him to let her leave. She did not beg. She was not a woman who begged, but she made the case plainly and without performance, the way you made a case to someone you had decided to treat as a reasonable person. She could go south to a village, find shelter, deliver the child in safety with people who knew what they were doing. She would not go to her family. She only wanted to be somewhere that was not this tower. He listened to all of it. He said no. "Those are my orders," he said again, which was true and also insufficient, and they both knew it, and the insufficiency sat between them in the firelight for the rest of the evening. She asked him once, on one of those evenings, about Ashara. He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. "You don't have to answer," she said. "No," he said. He started again. "She's my sister. She was at court for years. She was well when I last saw her. The court didn't," he stopped. Lyanna watched him with those gray eyes. "The king," she said, not a question. He said nothing. "I know what he does," Lyanna said. Her voice had a particular flatness that was not coldness but something adjacent to it, the flatness of a person who has been forced to understand things they should not have had to understand. "Every woman at court knows what he does. We just learn not to say it where anyone can hear us." He sat with this for a long moment. "She's stronger than people think," he said finally. He believed it because he needed to believe it. "She'll need to be," Lyanna said, and looked back at the fire, and they did not speak of it again. But something had passed between them in that exchange. The recognition of a shared understanding about what powerlessness looked like, and how it was survived, and the silence after it was a different quality of silence than the one before. In the 4th week, she tried to tell him what had happened. She had been careful until then. He had noticed this, the way she parceled out information about herself, giving small pieces and watching what he did with them before deciding whether to give more. He had respected it without commenting on it, which was itself a form of communication. On this particular evening, she had been sitting by the fire for longer than usual, and the quality of her silence was different. Not the ordinary silence of a woman who had run out of things she wanted to say, but the charged silence of someone building towards something. "I was riding," she said, "outside Riverrun. There's a wood to the east of the castle, a good road through it, and I'd been riding it in the mornings. I knew it well by then." He did not say anything. He looked at the fire. "They came out of the trees, went and," she stopped. "He was holding my horse's reins, Rhaegar, just holding them very calmly like it was the most natural thing in the world, and then pulled me from the saddle." Arthur was very still. "They tied my hands, they put something in my mouth. There was a cargo cart with a cover. I was in it for I don't know how long, weeks. He told me what I was for, what the child was for, and he forced." "That's enough," Arthur said. His voice came out more roughly than he had intended. He stood up. He walked to the door of the lower hall and he stood with his hand on the frame and he looked out at the yard, at the dark yard and the cold Dornish sky above it, and he breathed. He had known. He had not known in the specific sense, had not known the details, the cart, the wood outside river run, the exact mechanics of how it had been accomplished. But he had known in every sense that mattered. He had known from the moment Rhaegar had said she is here, she is with child, she is not to leave, with the ease of a man describing a piece of equipment he had secured for a necessary purpose. He had known, and he had kept the chain, and he had brought the trays upstairs, and he had stood in the yard and watched Rhaegar ride away, and he had said, "Yes, my prince," and none of those things could be undone. What she was trying to tell him now was the name for what he already knew, and he could not hear the name. Not because he did not believe it, but because hearing it said aloud would require him to sit in the same room with it and look at it directly, and he was not able to do that and continue to be a functional person in this tower for however many more weeks were required of him. He stood at the door for a long time. When he came back inside, she was looking at the fire. She did not look at him. She had understood, in the way of someone who had learned to read rooms very quickly over the past months, that the conversation was over. She never mentioned it again. Neither did he. The thing sat between them in the evenings after that, in the firelight, unspoken and entirely present, the way the worst things always were. By the 5th week no word had come from Rhaegar, no riders, no ravens, nothing. Arthur had no way of knowing whether the war had been won or lost, whether the prince was alive or dead, whether anyone was coming at all. By Arthur's count, the baby would not be due for another month. It had only been roughly 8 months since Lyanna disappeared, but what he could see, with the practical assessment of a man who had no medical training but could observe the obvious, was that Lyanna was going to give birth any day now. The child had dropped. She moved even more carefully than she had. She slept badly and woke often and ate little, and when she stood her breath shortened in ways that had nothing to do with exertion. He made his decision at the end of the 6th week. The nearest town was 4 hours south by horse. He would ride out at first light, fetch whoever could be found, and return before noon. It was the responsible thing. The child was what mattered, and the child needed a midwife, and waiting any longer was the less responsible choice. He went to bed, intending to leave at dawn. That night before he could, the child came.